In 1875 Wyoming Territory, a merciless blizzard rages as Elizabeth Caldwell and her fever-stricken son face certain death. Abandoned by her cruel in-laws after her husband's death, supplies dwindle in their remote cabin. Hope seems lost until a Cheyenne warrior named Swift Arrow discovers them near collapse. Their survival depends on trusting someone from a world she's been taught to fear. Comment where you are tuning in from before we start the video. Elizabeth Caldwell stared at the retreating wagon, her trembling hand clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the snow began to fall more heavily. 6-year-old James coughed weakly in her arms, his small body burning with fever. The cabin behind her was barely visible through the thickening flurries. "We'll be back in a week," her father-in-law William had promised, not meeting her eyes as he and her brother-in-law Robert loaded the last of their gear. But Elizabeth had heard their whispered conversation the previous night. She wasn't meant to survive this. "Mama, I'm cold," James whimpered, his voice raspy. Elizabeth turned away from the vanishing tracks and hurried inside the hunting cabin. It was little more than a single room with a small fireplace, a rickety table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed. She laid James gently on the bed, tucking the thin blankets around him. "I know, sweetheart, let me build up the fire." Her fingers shook as she added logs to the dying embers, coaxing them back to life. 3 months a widow and now this. Thomas had succumbed to pneumonia before the first snow, leaving her alone with his resentful family. Elizabeth checked the supplies they'd left. A small sack of flour, some dried beans, half a slab of salt pork, and a nearly empty jar of honey. In the corner stood a single barrel of water, her throat tightened. This wasn't enough to last a week, let alone the months of winter ahead. As darkness fell, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the cabin's walls. Elizabeth held James close, spooning broth into his mouth between fits of coughing. She'd used the last of the medicine that morning, hoping her in-laws would bring more from town. Now she understood why they hadn't. She killed our Thomas with her carelessness, William had snarled to Robert when they thought she was asleep. And now the boy's sick too. She's bad luck, that one. We're better off without them. "The storm will take care of it," Robert had replied. "No one will question 2 more deaths this winter." By morning, the blizzard had fully engulfed the cabin. Snow piled against the door and the wind screamed through every crack in the walls. James's fever raged higher. Elizabeth tore strips from her petticoat, soaked them in melted snow, and laid them across his forehead. "Please, God," she whispered, watching his labored breathing. "Not my boy too." 3 days passed. The firewood dwindled faster than Elizabeth had calculated. James drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for his father. Elizabeth barely slept, keeping the fire alive and tending to her son. On the 4th day, with the blizzard showing no signs of relenting, Elizabeth knew she had to try for help. Wrapping herself in every layer she owned and pressing a kiss to James's hot forehead, she forced the door open against the snowdrift and stepped into the howling white. The cold hit her like a physical blow. 10 steps from the cabin, the swirling snow had already obscured her view of it. 20 steps, and she was completely disoriented. Which way to town? Which way back? Panic rose in her throat as she realized her fatal mistake. She stumbled forward, then turned, desperately trying to find her way back to the cabin and James. By some miracle, she spotted a darker shadow in the white and staggered toward it. The cabin. Her fingers were numb as she pushed the door open and collapsed inside, shivering violently. It had been madness to try. They were truly trapped. The next morning brought fresh horror. Mice had gotten into the flour sack overnight, ruining most of what remained. James wouldn't keep down the broth she made from the beans. The firewood was down to the last few logs. Elizabeth sat beside the bed, holding James's hand as he slept fitfully. He was so thin now, his cheeks flushed with fever. She thought of the life they'd had before Thomas died, not perfect, but secure. She'd left her position as a schoolteacher to marry him against her family's wishes. Now she had no one. By the 7th day, Elizabeth had accepted that no one was coming for them. The firewood was gone except for a few twisted branches. James hadn't woken properly in hours. She wrapped him in all the blankets and her shawl, then ventured outside again, desperate to find something to burn. The storm had lessened slightly, enough that she could see the edge of the trees about 50 yards away. If she could just reach them, break off some branches. Each step through the knee-deep snow drained her remaining strength. The cold crept through her clothes into her bones, her vision blurred. Just as she reached the tree line, her legs gave way. Elizabeth fell forward into the snow, too exhausted to rise. As consciousness faded, she thought she saw movement ahead. a figure on horseback materializing from the white like a ghost. Swift Arrow had not meant to stray so far from his hunting party. The blizzard had separated them 3 days earlier, and he had been making his way slowly back toward their winter camp when he spotted the thin trail of smoke rising above the trees. White man's cabin, most likely. He should avoid it, but something pulled him closer. Perhaps it was the memory of his own wife and child, lost 2 winters ago to sickness. Perhaps it was mere curiosity. He guided his horse through the trees and saw the small cabin nearly buried in snow. And there, collapsed by the tree line, a woman. Swift Arrow dismounted quickly, approaching with caution. She was barely conscious, her lips blue with cold. A white woman alone in this wilderness. He scanned the area for signs of others but saw only a single set of footprints leading from the cabin. Making a swift decision, he lifted her. "James," she whispered, her eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. Swift Arrow carried her back to the cabin, pushing open the door with his foot. The interior was frigid, the fire nearly dead. And there on the bed lay a small boy, deathly still beneath a pile of blankets. The woman's son, he realized, both of them abandoned to die in this merciless storm. Elizabeth regained consciousness to find herself wrapped in an unfamiliar fur blanket beside a now blazing fire. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, then she saw him. A tall man with copper skin and long black hair, dressed in buckskins and furs, kneeling beside James's bed. Terror shot through her. She'd heard stories of Indian attacks on settlers, but as she struggled to sit up, she saw that the man was placing something on James's chest. A poultice of some kind with a sharp herbal smell. "Who are you?" she gasped. "What are you doing to my son?" The man turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. He spoke a few words in a language she didn't understand, then seemed to search for English. "Help," he finally said, gesturing to James. "Medicine." Elizabeth wanted to protest, to push this stranger away from her child, but what choice did she have? James was dying, and this man had already saved her from freezing to death. As if reading her thoughts, he pointed to the now roaring fire, then to a fresh stack of wood beside it. "You brought wood," she whispered. "Thank you." He nodded once, then returned his attention to James, singing softly as he worked. Elizabeth watched, torn between fear and desperate hope, as the stranger tended to her son with unexpected gentleness. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside the cabin, something unexpected had happened. Help had arrived from the last place Elizabeth Caldwell would have ever thought to look. By morning, James's breathing had eased slightly. Elizabeth touched his forehead, still hot but not the terrifying burn of the night before. She looked across the cabin where the Cheyenne warrior sat cross-legged by the fire, grinding something in a small stone bowl. "Water," he said, pointing to the mixture, then to James. Elizabeth nodded, fetching the cup. She watched as he added a pinch of the ground herbs to the water, stirring it with his finger. When he offered it to her, she hesitated only briefly before taking it to James. "James, sweetheart," she whispered, lifting his head, "try to drink this." To her surprise, James swallowed the mixture without protest. His eyes opened, clearer than they had been in days. "Who is that man, Mama?" he asked weakly. The warrior seemed to understand the question. He moved closer, kneeling beside the bed. "Swift Arrow," he said, touching his chest. "Swift Arrow," Elizabeth repeated. She placed her hand over her heart. "Elizabeth." Then she touched James's arm. "James." Swift Arrow nodded, then returned to the fire. Elizabeth watched as he pulled on his heavy fur coat. "You're leaving?" she asked, alarmed. He made a gesture of hunting, then pointed to his stomach and to James. "Food." He was going to find food. Elizabeth's relief was immediate and overwhelming. She nodded gratefully. While Swift Arrow was gone, Elizabeth tended to James, who drifted back to sleep after the medicine. She searched the cabin more thoroughly, hoping to find something she'd missed. Under a loose floorboard, she discovered a small cache, likely left by previous hunters, containing a knife, some fishing line, and a tarnished metal cup. Not much, but better than nothing. Swift Arrow returned hours later with 2 rabbits. The storm had lessened enough for hunting, though snow still fell steadily. Elizabeth watched in silence as he efficiently skinned and cleaned the animals, setting the pelts aside to dry and putting the meat into the pot she'd been using for James's broth. That night they ate the first real meal either Elizabeth or James had had in days. Swift Arrow showed her how to use every part of the rabbits, the bones for broth, the fur to be tanned later. When James asked him questions, Swift Arrow answered in his limited English or with gestures, patient with the boy's curiosity. "Will you teach me to hunt?" James asked, his voice stronger though still raspy. Swift Arrow looked to Elizabeth, seeming to ask permission. After a moment, she nodded. When you are strong, Swift Arrow told James, over the next few days a routine developed. Swift Arrow hunted or gathered firewood in the mornings. Elizabeth tended to James, whose strength returned slowly but steadily. In the afternoons, Swift Arrow worked on small projects, repairing a broken chair, strengthening the cabin's door, teaching James to carve simple shapes from wood when the boy was awake. Communication remained difficult. Swift Arrow knew some English words from trading with settlers, and Elizabeth proved a quick study with the Cheyenne phrases he taught her. Often they relied on gestures and expressions, developing a language of their own. One evening, as James slept, Elizabeth found the courage to ask about Swift Arrow's past. "Family?" she asked, making a cradling motion. Swift Arrow's expression darkened. He held up two fingers, then drew them across his chest before pointing to the ground. "Two people dead," Elizabeth guessed. He nodded. "Wife, son." The word seemed painful for him to say. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "How?" "Sickness, 2 winters." He held his hand at waist height. "Son like James." Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes, so that was why he had helped them so readily. He saw in James his own lost child. "My husband, Thomas," she said, pointing to her wedding ring. "Pneumonia before snow came." Swift Arrow nodded in understanding, a moment of shared grief passing between them. The blizzard finally broke after 2 weeks. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window and the forest beyond sparkled with fresh snow. James was well enough to sit up, eagerly watching as Swift Arrow showed him how to repair a snare. "Where did you learn English?" Elizabeth asked as she mended a tear in James's shirt. Swift Arrow looked up. "Trading post, many winters." "You were a trader," he shook his head. "Father, trade furs." He pointed to his eyes. "I watch, I listen." Elizabeth smiled. "James is like that too, always watching, learning." Swift Arrow nodded approvingly at the boy. "Good hunter someday." James beamed at the praise. "Will you teach me more about tracking animals?" Swift Arrow nodded, then said something in Cheyenne. When James looked confused, he translated. "Tomorrow, track rabbit." With the weather clearing, Swift Arrow should have returned to his people. Elizabeth knew this, and the thought filled her with unexpected dread. They would not survive alone, not yet. As if sensing her worry, Swift Arrow announced that evening that he would stay until moon changes. Another 2 weeks. During those days, he taught Elizabeth how to set snares, identify edible plants buried under the snow, and preserve meat for longer storage. To James, he showed tracking, simple hunting skills, and basic Cheyenne words. The boy soaked up the knowledge eagerly, his strength returning more each day. Elizabeth learned that Swift Arrow had been on a winter hunting expedition with 4 other warriors when the blizzard separated them. His people's winter camp was 3 days' ride to the north, where they were sheltering until spring. "They think I return when snow ends," he explained, "or think I join ancestors." "They believe you might be dead?" Elizabeth asked, alarmed. He shrugged. "It is way of winter, some do not return." Elizabeth was struck by the calm acceptance in his voice. Life on the frontier was harsh for everyone, it seemed. One afternoon, as Elizabeth and Swift Arrow worked together to tan the rabbit hides, they heard the distant sound of voices. Swift Arrow tensed immediately, moving to the window. "White men," he said, his voice low. Elizabeth joined him, peering out. 3 riders were approaching, following what must have been Swift Arrow's tracks to the cabin. "Stay inside," she told him, suddenly fearful. Relations between settlers and natives were tense at best, deadly at worst, but Swift Arrow shook his head. "They see horse," he said, pointing to where his horse was sheltered beside the cabin. The riders drew closer. Elizabeth recognized one as Peter Miller, a farmer whose land bordered the Caldwell property. "I'll speak to them," she said, reaching for her shawl. Swift Arrow caught her arm. "Danger," he warned. "Not if I go alone." She gave him a reassuring look. "Please stay with James." Reluctantly, Swift Arrow stepped back, positioning himself between the bed and the door as Elizabeth went outside. "Mrs. Caldwell," Miller called, clearly surprised. "We thought this cabin was abandoned." "Mr. Miller," Elizabeth acknowledged. "My son and I have been sheltering here." The men exchanged glances. "Your father-in-law said you'd gone back east after Thomas passed," said another man, whom Elizabeth recognized as the general store owner. "He was mistaken," Elizabeth replied stiffly. "James was too ill to travel." Miller's eyes narrowed. "That's an Indian horse," he said, nodding toward Swift Arrow's mount. Elizabeth's heart pounded. "Yes, a Cheyenne hunter found us during the blizzard. He saved our lives." The third man spat on the ground. Saved or captured, these savages can't be trusted, ma'am. He's inside with my son now, Elizabeth said firmly. And he's shown us nothing but kindness. The men exchanged dark looks. Miller dismounted. Step aside, Mrs. Caldwell. We'll handle this Indian problem. There is no problem, Elizabeth insisted, standing her ground. Please just go on your way. Can't do that, Miller said. Not with one of them so close to town. Just then the cabin door opened. Swift Arrow stood in the doorway, his face impassive but his posture alert. James peeked around him, calling out, Mama. The men reached for their rifles, but Elizabeth quickly stepped between them and Swift Arrow. He is not a threat, she said with quiet force. And I won't let you harm him. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Miller slowly lowered his rifle. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Caldwell, he warned. These people aren't like us. Perhaps that's for the best, Elizabeth replied, thinking of her in-law's betrayal. The men departed with many backward glances and muttered comments. Elizabeth knew their encounter would be the talk of the town by nightfall, bringing complications she wasn't ready to face. That night, as James slept, Swift Arrow spoke the words Elizabeth had been dreading. I go tomorrow, he said quietly. Not safe now. Elizabeth nodded, fighting unexpected tears. I understand. You learn much, he continued. Can survive until green time. He spent the evening showing her final skills, how to predict weather changes, how to stretch their supplies further, where to find the first spring plants when the snow began to melt. When morning came, Swift Arrow packed his few belongings. To James, he gave a small wooden carving of a horse. To Elizabeth, he left his extra knife and a small pouch of medicinal herbs. I watch, he promised, pointing to the forest. From far, Elizabeth stood in the doorway with James as Swift Arrow mounted his horse. The warrior raised his hand in farewell, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's one last time. Then he turned and rode into the forest, soon disappearing among the trees. Will we see him again, Mama? James asked, clutching his wooden horse. Elizabeth pulled her son close. I hope so, she whispered. I truly hope so. Spring arrived with reluctant warmth, melting the deep snows into muddy rivulets. Elizabeth and James had survived the remainder of winter using the skills Swift Arrow had taught them. Now, with the path to town finally passable, Elizabeth knew they could not remain isolated forever. We need proper supplies, James, she explained as they packed their few belongings. And perhaps I can find work in town. James clutched the wooden horse, carving to his chest. Will Swift Arrow find us if we leave? Elizabeth hesitated. I don't know, sweetheart, but we must think of our future now. The journey to town took most of a day, James riding their borrowed mule while Elizabeth walked alongside. She had decided against returning to the Caldwell homestead, unwilling to face the family that had left them to die. Pine Creek was a small settlement of wooden buildings clustered around a dusty main street. As they passed the general store, Elizabeth noticed how conversations halted and heads turned. News traveled fast in frontier towns, and it seemed word of their winter predicament had preceded them. There she is, a woman whispered loudly enough for Elizabeth to hear. The one who lived with that Indian. Elizabeth straightened her back and kept walking, guiding James toward the boarding house at the end of the street. Inside, the owner, Mrs. Peterson, a stern-faced widow, examined them critically. I'm not sure I have room, she said stiffly. Please, Elizabeth said, just until I find employment and more permanent lodgings. We can pay for a week. She offered the few coins she'd found in the cabin before leaving. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then took the money. 1 week, and mind you keep to yourselves. Their room was small and sparsely furnished, but clean. That evening, Elizabeth tucked James into bed, then sat by the window, gazing at the stars and wondering where Swift Arrow was now. The next morning, Elizabeth left James with Mrs. Peterson and went in search of work. The general store turned her away immediately. My customers wouldn't appreciate being served by someone with your associations, the owner said curtly. The saloon offered her work washing dishes, but Elizabeth declined, knowing it would mean leaving James alone late into the night. By midday, her hopes were fading. Outside the small church, she encountered Reverend Clark, a thin man with severe features. Mrs. Caldwell, he greeted her, I've heard of your unusual winter circumstances. We survived by God's grace, Elizabeth replied cautiously. And the assistance of a heathen, the Reverend added. The Lord works in mysterious ways, though one must be careful not to stray from the righteous path. Elizabeth bit back a sharp retort. Is there work available in town, Reverend? I need to support my son. Mrs. Wilson needs a laundress, he said after a moment. I could speak for you, but I must be assured you've renounced your sinful ways. Sinful ways, Elizabeth echoed in disbelief. Living with a savage, he clarified. Such behavior cannot be condoned regardless of the circumstances. Elizabeth stared at him. He saved our lives when my Christian family abandoned us to die. Nevertheless, the Reverend persisted, a public statement of your regret would ease concerns. I will not denounce a man who showed us nothing but kindness, Elizabeth said firmly. If that means we are unwelcome here, so be it. Despite her defiance, desperation eventually led Elizabeth to accept work as a laundress without the Reverend's recommendation. Mrs. Wilson, needing the help too badly to be particular, hired her with the stipulation that she work from a small shed behind the main laundry, away from customers' view. The work was grueling, hauling water, stoking fires, scrubbing linens until her hands cracked and bled. At night, she returned exhausted to their boarding house room where James waited with increasing restlessness. Why do people whisper about us, Mama? He asked one evening. Elizabeth sighed, pulling him onto her lap, though he was almost too big for it now. People fear what they don't understand, she explained. They don't know Swift Arrow like we do. I miss him, James confessed. He promised to teach me more tracking. I know, Elizabeth murmured, stroking his hair. I miss him too. Miles away, Swift Arrow stood before the council of elders in the Cheyenne camp. The older men listened gravely as he recounted his winter experiences. You risked much for these white settlers, said Grey Wolf, the oldest of the elders. Their kind have driven us from our hunting grounds, broken every treaty. A woman and child alone, Swift Arrow replied. Would you have left them to die? Their own people abandoned them, another elder pointed out. Why should we care for those they reject? Swift Arrow thought of James's thin face brightening as his fever broke, of Elizabeth's determined efforts to learn survival skills. They are not like the others, he said simply. All whites bring trouble, Grey Wolf warned. Remember your wife, remember your son. Swift Arrow flinched at the mention of his family, lost to the sickness that had swept through their camp 2 winters ago, a sickness brought by white traders. These two harmed no one, he insisted. The council would make no decision that day, but Swift Arrow knew many disapproved of his actions. That night, his cousin Two Hawks approached him by the fire. You think of the white woman, Two Hawks observed. Swift Arrow did not deny it. She has courage, the boy has a good spirit. Take care, brother, Two Hawks warned. Walking between two worlds is dangerous. Remember Tall Feather's fate. Swift Arrow did remember. Tall Feather had married a white missionary woman 5 summers ago. Both had been killed by raiders who called them traitors. Despite the warnings, Swift Arrow found himself drawn back toward the cabin as spring advanced. He discovered it empty but followed tracks to the town of Pine Creek. From the cover of the surrounding hills, he watched the settlement, eventually spotting Elizabeth hanging laundry behind a building. She looked thinner, her movements weary. The boy, James, was not with her. Swift Arrow waited until nightfall, then left a freshly killed rabbit and a pair of finely made moccasins at the back door of what he determined was their lodging. 3 times over the following weeks, he left similar gifts. Once he glimpsed James playing behind the boarding house and saw the boy was still carrying the wooden horse. Something tightened in Swift Arrow's chest at the sight. While Swift Arrow observed from afar, Elizabeth's situation in town grew increasingly precarious. Her in-laws had spread rumors that she had abandoned Thomas before his death, driving him to illness with her heartlessness. When confronted at the general store one afternoon, Elizabeth lost her temper. William and Robert Caldwell left me and a sick child in a remote cabin to die during a blizzard, she declared loudly. If anyone should be judged for unchristian behavior, it is them. The accusation caused a stir, but few were willing to challenge the well-established Caldwell family against a woman rumored to have gone native. One evening, returning late from work, Elizabeth found Mrs. Peterson waiting with a grim expression. I'll need your room by week's end, the woman announced. This is a respectable house. What have I done? Elizabeth demanded. There's talk of Indian trouble brewing, Mrs. Peterson replied. And you're known to be friendly with them. I can't risk my business. That night, as James slept, Elizabeth stared at the moccasins Swift Arrow had left them, her 3rd pair since coming to town. She had recognized his handiwork immediately and kept the gifts hidden. But someone must have seen him near town. 2 days later, Elizabeth returned from work to find a crowd gathered outside the boarding house. Smoke billowed from their room's window. James, she screamed, pushing through the onlookers. He's safe, a voice called. Dr. Thompson, the town physician, approached with James in tow. I was passing by when the fire started and got him out. What happened? Elizabeth asked, clutching James to her. Lantern accident, they're saying, the doctor replied, but his expression suggested doubt. Mrs. Caldwell, a word in private. When they were alone, Dr. Thompson spoke frankly. That was no accident, and this town is becoming unsafe for you both. Because I won't lie about who saved us, Elizabeth asked bitterly. Partly, the doctor admitted, but mostly because your former father-in-law has significant influence here and your presence challenges his account of events. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly. We have nowhere else to go, the cabin, James suggested, tugging at her skirt. We could go back to the cabin. Elizabeth looked down at her son, then at their smoldering possessions. The decision formed with sudden clarity. Yes, she said, we'll return to the cabin. They left at dawn the next morning, Dr. Thompson discreetly providing supplies for their journey. The mule was still weary from their trip to town, forcing them to travel slowly. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. We need to find shelter, Elizabeth called to James, who rode ahead on the mule. The downpour quickly turned to a deluge. Elizabeth's dress became sodden, weighing her down. The path grew treacherous with mud. When James began coughing, that same terrible cough from winter, fear clutched at her heart. Just a little further, she encouraged, though she wasn't certain they were even on the right path anymore. Lightning flashed, startling the mule. James cried out as the animal reared, nearly throwing him. Elizabeth lunged to catch her son as thunder crashed overhead. Exhausted and disoriented, they stumbled on through the storm. James's coughing worsened, and his skin felt hot to Elizabeth's touch. Not again, she prayed. Please, not again. It was in this desperate state, half carrying James through the rain, that Elizabeth failed to notice the steep embankment ahead. Her foot slipped in the mud and they tumbled down the slope, coming to rest in a jumble of wet limbs and supplies. Mama, James whimpered, his voice frightened. I'm here, Elizabeth assured him, though pain shot through her ankle when she tried to stand. We'll be all right. But as night approached and the storm continued, Elizabeth faced the grim reality of their situation. Lost, injured, with a sick child and dwindling supplies, she held James close under the meager shelter of a fallen log, shivering as the temperature dropped. Swift Arrow will find us, James murmured feverishly. He watches from far. Elizabeth pressed her lips to his forehead, feeling the heat of returning fever. Yes, she whispered, though she had no reason to believe it true. He'll find us. But as darkness enveloped them completely, hope faded with the light. Until through the curtain of rain, Elizabeth glimpsed movement on the ridge above. A mounted figure silhouetted against the stormy sky. Swift Arrow dismounted in one fluid motion, sliding down the muddy embankment with practiced ease. When he reached Elizabeth and James, his expression remained calm, but his eyes revealed deep concern. You are hurt, he said, kneeling beside them. James is sick again, Elizabeth replied, her voice breaking. His fever returned. Swift Arrow touched the boy's forehead, his mouth tightening. Without another word, he lifted James into his arms, then helped Elizabeth to her feet. She winced as she put weight on her injured ankle. My camp is near, Swift Arrow told her, supporting her with one arm while holding James with the other. Not far. The journey was slow and painful. Elizabeth gritted her teeth against each step, leaning heavily on Swift Arrow. Rain continued to fall, though less violently now. By the time a small cluster of hide tents came into view, she was nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Several Cheyenne warriors emerged at their approach, expressions wary. Swift Arrow spoke rapidly in their language. A woman hurried forward, taking James from his arms and carrying him toward the largest tent. She will help, Swift Arrow assured Elizabeth, guiding her after the woman. Medicine woman, like your doctor. Inside the tent, warm and dry, the woman was already wrapping James in soft furs and preparing a drink similar to what Swift Arrow had given him during the blizzard. Elizabeth sank down beside her son, overcome with relief and gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, looking up at Swift Arrow. You found us again. I watch, he said simply, echoing his promise from months ago. For 3 days, James rested in the Cheyenne camp, his fever gradually subsiding under the medicine woman's care. Elizabeth's ankle was bound with herb-soaked bandages that reduced the swelling remarkably fast. Though many in the camp remained distant, a few showed kindness, particularly the medicine woman, Morning Star, and Swift Arrow's cousin, Two Hawks. On the third evening, as Elizabeth sat outside watching the sunset, Swift Arrow joined her. Your son grows stronger, he observed. Soon he can travel. Elizabeth nodded, understanding the implication. We cannot stay. Some here fear trouble from white men if you remain, Swift Arrow confirmed. Our council debates. We were returning to the cabin, Elizabeth explained. We cannot go back to town. Swift Arrow was silent for a long moment. Why did you leave town? Elizabeth described the burning of their room, the hostility of the townspeople, and her confrontation with her former in-laws. Swift Arrow listened without interruption. Your people rejected you because you accepted help from mine, he finally said. And your people are wary of me because I am white, Elizabeth added with a sad smile. We belong nowhere, it seems. Before Swift Arrow could respond, a commotion rose at the edge of camp. Two young warriors rode in, speaking urgently. The camp mobilized immediately, women gathering children, men reaching for weapons. What is happening? Elizabeth asked, fear tightening her chest. Riders coming, Swift Arrow explained tersely. Many, armed. Elizabeth followed his gaze to see a cloud of dust on the horizon. Is it because of us? Swift Arrow didn't answer, instead leading her quickly back to the tent where James was sleeping. Stay here, he instructed. Do not come out. Through the tent flap, Elizabeth watched the Cheyenne warriors form a defensive line at the camp's edge. Swift Arrow stood among them, his posture straight and proud. The approaching riders slowed as they neared the camp, at least 10 men, led by a figure Elizabeth recognized with horror. Robert Caldwell, her brother-in-law. We know you've got the woman and boy, Robert shouted. Hand them over and there won't be trouble. One of the Cheyenne elders stepped forward, speaking in careful English. No woman or child held here against will. They're harboring a known Indian sympathizer, another rider called. Elizabeth recognized the voice of Peter Miller, the man who had confronted them at the cabin. The woman's dangerous, Robert added. Killed my brother with her wickedness, then bewitched this savage. Elizabeth's blood boiled at the lie. Without thinking, she pushed out of the tent, ignoring Swift Arrow's sharp command to stay hidden. I did not kill Thomas, she declared, limping forward. He died of pneumonia while you watched and did nothing. Then you abandoned a grieving widow and sick child to die in a blizzard. The riders shifted uncomfortably. A new voice spoke from among them. Is this true, Robert? Dr. Thompson rode forward, his expression grave. You told me they'd gone east of their own accord. Robert's face darkened. She's lying. And now she's corrupting these savages against decent folk. No one forced us to stay here, Elizabeth countered. Swift Arrow saved our lives when our own family left us to die. He's shown more Christian charity than anyone in Pine Creek. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Elizabeth realized with growing dread that many of the riders had their hands on their weapons. The Cheyenne warriors similarly stood ready. A single wrong move could trigger bloodshed. A small voice suddenly called out behind her. Mama! James stood in the tent opening, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Seeing the armed men, his eyes widened in fear. It's all right, James, Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. Go back inside. But James had spotted Swift Arrow among the warriors. To everyone's surprise, he darted forward, ducking past Elizabeth to stand beside the Cheyenne man. Leave my father alone, the boy declared, glaring at the riders. A murmur ran through both groups. Elizabeth froze, seeing the shock on Robert's face transform to disgust. You see, he spat. The boy's been corrupted too. James gripped Swift Arrow's hand tightly. The warrior looked down at the child, then raised his eyes to meet Elizabeth's. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Swift Arrow knelt beside James, speaking gently in his ear. The boy nodded, then reluctantly returned to Elizabeth's side. This woman and child harm no one, Swift Arrow said, addressing the riders directly. They seek only peace. Dr. Thompson dismounted, approaching slowly with his hands visible. Mrs. Caldwell, I believe you, he said, and I'm not the only one. There are those in town who have questioned the Caldwell story. She's chosen her side, Robert snarled. Living with Indians, letting her son call one father. Perhaps she's chosen humanity over prejudice, Dr. Thompson countered. He turned to the other riders. We came to ensure the safety of a woman and child, not to start a war. Some of the men nodded, lowering their weapons slightly. Robert's face flushed with anger. Fine, he snapped. She wants to live like a savage, let her die like one. He wheeled his horse around. Come on, boys, they're not worth the ammunition. Several riders followed immediately, but others hesitated, looking uncertainly between Robert and Dr. Thompson. The doctor stayed firmly in place. Mrs. Caldwell, he said quietly, what do you wish to do? Elizabeth looked at the Cheyenne camp, at Swift Arrow, and finally at James. We need a home, she said simply, somewhere James can grow up safely. Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. There's a valley about 3 hours' ride from here, he said, Fertile land not claimed by either whites or Indians, neutral ground you might say. Swift Arrow stepped forward. I know this place. Would you consider settling there? The doctor asked Elizabeth. It might provide a solution, at least for now. Robert, who had stopped to listen, laughed harshly. You're suggesting she live alone in the wilderness? She'll be dead within a month. She will not be alone, Swift Arrow stated firmly. The implication hung in the air. Elizabeth's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. You would leave your people? She asked Swift Arrow softly. My people are those who show honor and courage, he replied. I have found such people in unexpected places. Grey Wolf, the elder who had spoken earlier, approached Swift Arrow. They conversed briefly in Cheyenne, their expressions solemn. Finally, Grey Wolf nodded and turned to Elizabeth. Our council has decided, he announced in surprisingly clear English. Swift Arrow may choose his own path. If you accept him, we will not interfere. And what about the townspeople? Elizabeth asked, looking at Dr. Thompson. Some will never accept it, the doctor admitted. But others might in time. Especially if you maintain a peaceful presence. Robert spat on the ground. You're all fools, he growled, then galloped away with his few remaining supporters. As the dust from their departure settled, Elizabeth found herself at the center of an extraordinary gathering, Cheyenne elders, remaining townsmen led by Dr. Thompson and Swift Arrow, standing as if between two worlds. James, she said, turning to her son, what do you think about living in this valley Dr. Thompson mentioned, with Swift Arrow? The boy asked hopefully. Elizabeth met Swift Arrow's gaze. If he wishes to join us. Swift Arrow's normally impassive face softened. I wish this, he confirmed. The valley proved even more beautiful than described, sheltered by gentle hills with a clear stream running through its center and fertile soil for planting. Elizabeth, James, and Swift Arrow built their cabin where the stream widened, incorporating elements of both cultures in its construction. The first year was difficult. They faced disapproval from both sides, occasional harassment from settlers, and the constant challenges of frontier life. But they persevered, creating something unique in that valley, a home that belonged to neither world and both. Swift Arrow officially adopted James in a Cheyenne ceremony attended by 2 hawks and a few other tribal members who had accepted their unusual family. Elizabeth began teaching not only James but several other children, both settler and Cheyenne, who arrived cautiously at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Dr. Thompson visited regularly, bringing supplies and news. Gradually others followed, curious settlers, Cheyenne families interested in trading, people drawn to the peculiar peace of the valley. A small community began to form, neither fully white nor fully native, but something new. You have created a bridge, 2 hawks observed one evening, watching children from both backgrounds playing together near the cabin. Not intentionally, Elizabeth replied. We simply wanted to survive. Sometimes the strongest bridges are built from necessity, Swift Arrow added, his English much improved after years of daily use. As twilight descended on the valley, Elizabeth watched James teaching a younger child how to carve a wooden horse, using the skills Swift Arrow had taught him. Her son had grown tall and strong with his father's gentle heart and Swift Arrow's quiet confidence. He moved easily between the cultures, respected by both. Swift Arrow joined her on the cabin porch, his hand finding hers with the comfortable familiarity of years shared. Any regrets? He asked softly, following her gaze to the children. Elizabeth shook her head, thinking of the desperate woman in the blizzard, certain she and her son would die alone. None, she answered truthfully. This is exactly where we belong. Many years later, a man rode into the valley with his family, a woman with Cheyenne features and 3 children of mixed heritage. He approached the central building, now a proper schoolhouse, where a memorial stone stood under a towering oak tree. Papa, who are they? Asked his youngest daughter, pointing to the names carved into the stone. James Caldwell smiled, touching the weathered surface gently. They were my parents, he explained. Elizabeth Caldwell and Swift Arrow. They built this place when no one thought it possible. The bridge builders, his wife added, using the name the Cheyenne had given the couple. James nodded, looking around at what had become a thriving community. Where once stood a single cabin, now dozens of homes housed families of various backgrounds. The schoolhouse taught children in both English and Cheyenne. A trading post served as neutral ground for commerce between cultures that had once been enemies. They created something new, James told his children, in a world that only understood old divisions. They taught us that sometimes survival means finding warmth in the heart of the blizzard. His oldest son placed a carved wooden horse at the base of the memorial, continuing a tradition begun decades earlier. Around them, the valley continued to flourish, a testament to what could grow from the most desperate circumstances when courage, compassion, and love overcame prejudice and fear.